today, our podcast is a really, I think, important one, particularly with the temperature of the nation. And I'm, lucky to have Lauren here, who can often speak so eloquently and professionally on topics like this. Ages ago, and you may have even heard it in one of the podcasts, one of our former staff members referred to us as Indian Head Camp. And, some people still do that to this day. And, we always remind, we're Camp IHC, but there's a reason, that we did change that. And hopefully by the end of this podcast, you'll understand the whys and the hows, and maybe some of the challenges, but also the joys that we came through, to this decision. So, Lauren, thank you for joining me for a very important podcast.
No, I'm excited to be, on this podcast with you. As you know, this has been an important topic for us internally, as a camp. And I think starting off there, right, is that there's this global term of camp, and I just said as a camp, but we often talk about the importance of stripping that global concept of camp down into, its individual parts. And what that is that it's a group of people, Joel and I as the owners, you and Susie as, our assistant directors, been at IHC for more than your life now, I think, than not. Obviously, Maddie Lehman, who grew up at camp, started camp at 6 years old, and he's now inching his way closer to his 40th decade, or fourth decade, not quite there yet, but anyway, is that camp is made up of people. And I think that's something that I encourage everybody to think about with regards to every single organization or, group that you are involved with, that at the root of it are just human beings that are doing their work or their life's work or whatever, you want to call it. But that for us, camp and Camp IHC is us, it's the foundation of it is that we have this passion for working with young people, whether that's campers or staff or, our campers who are adults who come and take part in our, CNC events, our adult retreats, but we are in the business of, welcoming people, making them feel good, allowing them to have fun and be carefree. And we had this conversation a long time ago, about was our name consistent with our mission, right? And it was a name that we inherited. Mm-hmm. Camp IHC has been in existence for, over 80 years. Joel and I are the fourth generation owners. Well, we're not generational. The couple who owned it before us are our family, but before that, it was not in our family. But we're the fourth owners, and we inherited the name Indian Head Camp. And obviously, as IHC became ours, and I do extend beyond Joel and I, like that, you as well, you and Susie and Maddie, people have been there from the beginning. We really felt that although this was a successful business, recognizable by so many, loved and adored by so many, that its actual name was completely out of alignment with our values and with that mission of making people feel good, right? And that was a discussion that we had over a decade ago, and we're confused and scared. I want to be really honest on this podcast. This is what I've learned is that any topic such as this, can be met with criticism, even if your intentions are in the right place. So off the bat, I want to acknowledge to all the listeners that I am not a perfect person. I'm not a finished product. I'm a work in progress. I do believe that I have a heart that strives to be good, and I'm doing my best, right? I'm also doing my best to try and raise really good humans in my 4 children. But I'm not perfect. I'm learning, right? And I don't have all the answers. I'm certainly not righteous. I'm trying really hard to steer my little corner of the universe to inclusivity. And I want to have this podcast and talk about some of the harder stuff, because I just think honesty and open dialogue is key to understanding where you've been and where you're trying to go, and making sense of the whole picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. And I think what I can add to that and then almost transition you is, you talk about those conversations we had. And one of the hardest conversations that Susie and I had that then again brought it to the forefront is staff recruiting in the Southwest. And I, and people who don't know me, identify as a he, him, a male. I am, Caucasian, and I was called Euro white trash by a Lakotan by having a conversation because she was curious about the name of our camp, and not the first person to have that conversation. But I was very respectful. I was very, tell me, what is it we're doing to help me understand it, and then bringing that back. And I know I wasn't one of the only ones. And, and that was maybe 2016, 2017, I think, Lauren. And I think is that, if I recall, is that when it just started feeling more real for us that, wait, we can't, when did we start not justifying it, recognizing it, but also sort of saying like Indian doesn't represent us,
Right. So I think that, probably when I reached 30 and was entering into a different phase of my own life, like I was, and I'm ashamed to tell you, it took me till I got to 30, but, to be more aware of, social issues and really kind of think about, especially because I was a mother at that point. I had just welcomed my second son into the world. And I was thinking more about what I wanted the world to be for them, right? So I was at a different phase of my own life where I was becoming more introspective. I was also looking out into the world and saying, like, what do I believe? What are my values? Like, how do I want to show up in the world for other people? And at the same time, kind of recognizing the story of, like, the United States, and I'm British, as you know.
Yeah.
The story of obviously I knew the story of the US. Like, I went to school, like you learn about it in school, but like really thinking about, like, wow, like how much this country is in its infancy, and what actually must have gone on back, then, to people who were the original people of this land. And really like reflecting on that, at the same time, you're right. There was more, heightened, awareness. It was becoming more in the mainstream media, still very, very slight,
Early
but
days.
it was
early
there.
days.
Right. So in some ways, like I was like, well, I'm not crazy. Like, so I think that for anybody listening, I'm sure that there's a flavor for some people that says, oh my goodness, the fact that she didn't acknowledge this before is like, maybe she's a horrible person. And I would just defend myself and say, I'm not, but I was ignorant. That's for sure. Like that, I will say I was ignorant, and, but I didn't stay in ignorance, or I didn't like shun away from, like, as reality started to be, clearer to me, I didn't meet that with like conflict or, justification. When you saw it, I saw it. Do you know what I mean? And immediately wanted to do something about that. So I think that, I couldn't ignore the realities of what Indigenous people had gone through in this country, how they continue to, experience, their lives in many ways. And then I really felt like, well, I want to start a dialogue with, people whose my camp is essentially named after, even though we don't serve any Indigenous people at that time. We maybe had 1 or 2 staff members come through. And I really want to go fact find, is that, I want to ask the questions. I'd had a couple of American staff it over the years be quite aggressive towards me about the name. And I didn't really understand why they were so aggressive. Because of my ignorance, I didn't defend it. I was just like, I don't understand why they're so angry. Obviously, now I also know that if you want to move the needle and force change, you don't do it with aggression. You don't do it with being mean. You don't do it with attacking people. That is never going to, that's a game changer. People meet resistance with resistance, right? So even though I appreciate where they were coming from, and of course it was important to me because it also made me pay more attention too. I also do know, on reflection, that if I ever want to push the needle of change, I'm not going to do it in that way. I think important, meaningful, kind, educational communication is paramount, right? Yeah. But anyway, there were staff members who had raised it, and I just felt that I was so proud of the work that we were doing at IHC, that camper experience, the staff's experience, how people grow. I just spoke to a parent yesterday of a current camper, and we agreed that what kids can achieve, develop, create over a 7-week period away from home, at sleepaway camp cannot be replicated anywhere else on earth. It can't, right?
It's experiential, hands-on, no textbooks.
Nothing.
You're in the social atmosphere, physically, emotionally, mentally.
Exactly. So I'm so proud of what we are doing, but yet I'm so ashamed and embarrassed of our name. But I'm so also torn internally. There was no, just so everybody is aware, there was no dilemma in my head about what was right and wrong. And I know people say you should steer clear of what's right and wrong. For me, the name Indian Head Camp was wrong. That was clear, crystal clear to me.
And I think in some ways we're also, not only was it, offensive to Indigenous, but we're it doesn't even represent. Is it India? Is it Indian? Is it there was just confusion in the semantics of the name, so there's a lot of things that when you look back, it was named after a rock outcrop, right? So there's all these different things that, is it you? Is it us? Like you're saying, right? So I agree that when you say we were all on that same page, but so you were about to say though, what was the sticking? Why was it 2018 that you finally said, no, guys, we got to do this?
Because we couldn't take it anymore. We knew that internal voice, that moral compass, that thing was so strong that it was time. And we basically, the dilemma though was that I didn't want to make people mad, because obviously, for any listener that's not been to camp, people are rightly so connected to their camp. You have this life informing experience growing up at camp. Some people come as campers, some people that happens as staff, and you are so attached to it. And that name, Indian Head Camp, that is it, and for somebody, especially me at that age, obviously for a lot of the older campers or, people who were alum, who was I, this young punk that had only, owned the camp for less than a decade and, had married in. who was she to say that the camp's name was going to change? And I knew that that was going to ruffle feathers. I also know that we don't all see the world through the same lens.
Yeah.
And that some people would say, well, that is way too politically correct. What are we, like, woke? Like, what's wrong with tradition? Like, and maybe come up with the narrative of justification. I wasn't worried about defending it. I just hated that it was going to cause disharmony. But at the end of the day, I also recognized that I was creating disharmony by staying in neutral and doing nothing. So no matter what, it created, kind of disharmony for a certain group of people. I believe that we were on the right side of the fight. And I also believe that when you are conduct yourself with integrity, when your heart is in the right place, when you're, I believe, pushing the needle in the direction of, social justice in many ways, everything else will ultimately fall into place. I believe that. I believe that the world conspires in your favor when you are on the right side of an important narrative, or movement. So it was a risk that I was worth taking. And I suppose, I know it sounds like really kind of like, out there, but like Joel and I both were like, I would rather fail with integrity than succeed feeling like I was living a life of hypocrisy. And that's what it came down to. Like, Joel and I, like, we are not driven by money. That is not why we do what we do.
Yep, exactly.
We are driven by the experience of owning camp, running camp, seeing how that enriches our lives as well as other people's. So I guess we kind of were like, well, if everybody leaves and there's no camp, we will do something else. Like, we would have been heartbroken, but we would have been like at peace with it, right? But what was actually incredible is that, though of course there were some people that, feathers were ruffled or didn't fully understand, the vast, vast majority of people actually emailed or communicated with us saying, this is why I have my children at your camp, or, emailed to say, we commend you for doing the right thing. A lot of people didn't feel comfortable with it themselves, but, just kind of went along with it. So the most of our community really rallied behind us. And it really didn't take that much to move past that. I mean, I don't know if your experience was the same. I mean, you were there, you remember, the name change and
the name change. And again, to speak to that side of things, for those who weren't in it, it was, a huge, like, we're Indian Head Camp. Like, I was Indian Head Camp for 18, 19 years, and I, like you said, had a hard time going to these Southwest regional places where there was a bigger indigenous population and movement, and almost feeling embarrassed. And when there was a sense of relief when we all talked about it and we brought it to the table. And I was so proud of that decision, so that even when there's former staff members or parents that are say like, oh, Indian Head, I said, oh yeah, we used to be Indian Head, but we're moving forward because IHC is who we are. We're the same camp. And I think that's that one piece. It's almost like we're parents afraid, we're veterans afraid that they were losing something. Lauren, did you feel that as well? Like, I think I felt like they thought that like Indian Head was disappearing, when reality is the name was disappearing, but the experience and the traditions and, the really positive things, at least I believe, and then I'm sure you'll say yes, are still very much there. Like the camp, the 7-week experience that you said.
Yeah. And I think that this comes back obviously to the psychology of like, how our childhood informs us and our belief systems and all of that, and experiences that we hold really dear to our heart that are the blueprint of who we then become as adults. Right. Nobody wants anybody to meddle with that if it was a good experience, because that is deep and ingrained, and it's very difficult to to consider change for that, even if it's justifiable or like a no-brainer change, like when that is deep rooted in your childhood and such a positive experience, that's very difficult. And I understood that and respected that. At the same time, you know, we also, Joel, myself, you know, Dave and Shelley at this point too, as well as you and Maddie and Susie and, you know, people involved, we also knew that at any point, anybody can tiptoe and back off the name Indian Head Camp. And ultimately, it was a reflection of us more than anybody else. Right. So it's one thing to have a really bold, opinionated voice about why the name shouldn't change. But unless you own it or you work for it, like you can tiptoe and back away from that in any way, shape, or form you feel comfortable with. And that had been evident to us over the years, right? Is that when your feet are ultimately held to the fire, where does your heart lie? Like, and that's when you find out, right? And I remember once having a conversation with an alum when I was like, when you own your camp, you can call it Indian Head Camp if you think that's appropriate. Right. My camp will not be using any indigenous terminology or symbols or anything like that, because that is in alignment with me. And, you know, I think there was maybe one conversation about that. But you know what's really funny, Mark? You know, it just reminds me of, obviously, you know, owning and directing one of the biggest camps in the Northeast. And I don't mean biggest as in size, although it is a sizable camp. I mean, like one of the big names. You know, we are obviously, you know, grateful that it's a success story, right? But
we're influencing our campers, our staff. We have social networks that branch out,
right?
You know, like, so we're known. You know, and not trying to float our own boat. I totally what you're saying is that
we're on the map, right? We're on the map, right?
And people look to us and see us and hear us, and you know, like.
So what always, like, you know, I don't chuckle because like I wish that the world was, you know, in a different place. But like, if I'm like having a cup of coffee with a girlfriend, or maybe I'm like meeting a camper parent, you know, just to say hello, and people introduce me, you know, and say, this is Lauren, she's the owner of Camp IHC, where my kids go to camp. It's amazing the number of people that say, oh, I know Indian Head. And they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, it's not Indian Head anymore, is it? It's Camp IHC. It will always be Indian Head to me. And it's just amazing to me because that ignorance astounds me, right? That we are now in this moment when all the major sports teams, like everybody's talking about it, high schools can't do it. Like change has it's like here, right? Yeah, and you, as a grown woman, you know, and a lot of these people are women that have kids, and like them and I, we have so much in common. And I'm like, it's okay that to you, it could always be Indian Head Camp, but it astounds me that that's a name that you still, in today's day and age, are fine using. Like that it's not a debate anymore about whether or not that's derogatory or, you know, harmful or shameful, or that's not a debate. Like the people have spoken, like they've told us what they think about it. Like people who are indigenous to this country, who are the ones that are, you know, qualified to tell us, have been loud and clear. You not being able to shift that is about your ignorance and your unwillingness to change. Because the camp, we own the camp as Indian Head Camp. I have never called it Indian Head Camp since the day we changed the name. If I can shift it, so can you. It's a choice.
Yeah, and it's a choice. And Lauren, what do you think, though? You know, we spoke a little bit about this, you know, off before, is regionally, the social networks that you're in, the networking. We at IHC are incredibly exposed to so many different cultures that come and work with us, different backgrounds. And with that just opens up our networks even further. as I said, regionally, I'm in the Southwest, Southeast, Northwest. So by having such diverse staff and opportunities, and then we are then exposed, our staff go out and seek education and learnings, and because we don't want to just change to change. We want to recognize and ask questions and hear from people, and then have this background where is that still where the ignorance is coming, because it's just easier to know what you know, and just to say, it's because I believe you say best, change ain't easy.
Change ain't easy. And you're also a product of your environment. So look, I would say a couple of things. I would say, of course, geographic region in the United States is very informing of your opinions on things. Your experience in childhood is also going to inform you. If you're grown up with diversity is something that you embrace. If you're raised in, without that, it's more of a challenge, and doesn't mean a bad challenge. It just means that your growth in that, an understanding of that might take a little bit longer. Like me, like I talked about, like I definitely loved everybody, but I was ignorant. Like up until recently, I didn't understand, that I had to be, for example, an anti-racist, not just like, I'm not racist. I, have obviously, like, my family, we're multicultural, like, but I need to be an anti-racist, right? So that wasn't driven by me not being a good person. It was just driven by ignorance, right? So I use myself as an example of somebody who grew up in a very homogeneous, place, that diversity didn't touch my life until I was a young adult, right? And then I really got into my groove of understanding, as I got older, as I said earlier. So that informs you. But I do want to share that, one of the joys of our job is connecting with so many 18 to 25-year-olds from all over the country, from all over places in Europe and Australia and New Zealand. We have kids from, I call them kids. I mean, young people, young adults from Mexico.
That's what happens when we get more experience. As we get older, they become kids.
They become kids. But they are all intolerant of social injustice. And that's a beautiful thing. So for anybody, who maybe is kind of my generation or a little bit older, who was calling saying the name doesn't need to change, that's ridiculous. This experience that you send your children to, or eventually your young adult to work in, is built upon this generation of 18 to 25-year-olds. They are the secret sauce. Yes, we have the facility, and I like to think that we have good leadership and can set them up for success. But they are the magic. They are what this experience is built on. And IHC is so successful because of the quality of 18 to 25-year-olds who's coming to work at our camp, and their willingness to give these kids the most incredible summer of their life, or the school group who's renting our facility, or the adult group who's coming, to recharge their life, or whatever it is. Like, our staff are the secret sauce, right? I want to tell the listeners that all of them care about the name. They all want social change. So this is a force that the 40-year-olds, and above can try and push back on, but change is coming. Like, this is a force, and I love that. It gives me so much hope for the future. And if we hadn't, made the stance and made the change, the camp would not be as successful as it is, because it wouldn't have attracted the like-minded people that we so desperately want to be part of our community. So we didn't know that at the time. Like, when we changed the name, like, this was us. We were that young cohort that were like pushing the needle and progressive, and there's nothing woke about it. It's just like, it's just
the right thing, and it feels right.
It feels good. Yes. And,
to be
And
able to hire staff, Lauren, and if I may
yeah,
interject, exactly what you're saying there, it feels so good to be able to say we are Camp IHC, and to be able to say we were at this point, to have a storyline of change and progression, even to the point where the use and this, we could go on this topic forever. Should we put pronouns in our signature? Should we, how we hire, and equitability and accessibility? And I mean, there's so many things that, and to address, like you said, we are not perfect, right? But we're willing to listen. We're willing to change. We just need that time. We need knowledge. We need people to, motivate us and inform us. But also, I think you said it really well, is just also be patient and kind with that language. Whereas if you put up that aggression kind of way, you're going to maybe be met with a very defensive aggression. So, but what you're saying, what I'm hearing is exactly, it's like we have these staff that are so positive and so forward thinking. And we, even though we're older, it's almost like, would you say now we're wiser? With like that word wisdom comes in, is like we have that experience and we're willing to hear and listen and explain and adapt. And that balance is what brings great success, to that role and that change and the name change.
yeah. And I think, like, I want to make it clear, like, the motivation wasn't, though we'll make our staff happy. Like, that was a byproduct of
Right.
us, that, coming back to my thing about the universe conspires in your favor, like when you're on the right side of the fight, like, is that we couldn't in our wildest dreams have realized how fruitful this decision, which just was the right decision for us, because we believe in getting rid of all of these indigenous language or symbols or whatever. But then, like I say, like, this generation of young person, which our experience is ultimately built upon, really value that. And that's a tremendous force. Like, our life's work is about raising children and young people and being contributors to raising them, or I should say.
Yeah.
And we are encouraged, like, even though when I watch the news and, I see everything that's going on, I am encouraged. I feel positive because I know what's coming through. And that's a force that nobody can challenge. Like, it's a losing battle.
Yeah.
And that fills me up with so much hope.
So, for those, there's still camps out there, there's people out there, that kind of, are at that roadblock. And, if anything, what would be some wisdom from your experience, Joel's experience, our experience, that if you were to sort of say, what can I expect? Like, we're thinking about changing our name. What's the pushback? What's this? Or how do I get through this?
Right,
Is there
right.
some words of wisdom that you can take from your experiences, to help people just acknowledge that maybe this is their time to make a change? And maybe it's not a name change. Maybe it's something else that, fits into the diversity, equity, inclusion aspect of things. But
Right. And I do have, I could share some of my experience. I want to say that, like, I actually use the term, and I don't really believe that it should be used. I said the good side of the fight. I don't think this should be a fight. I think
nice.
that, I think fight is the wrong word. It's that we were on the good side of what was of our integrity, right? Is that we believe in integrity and we want to live, with integrity. So the decision was in the right side of that fight, right? The fight for integrity for ourselves, right? Let me frame it that way. And I guess that then leads me to my advice to anybody who, is part of any organization or runs an organization or owns an organization, that has something in it that they don't feel good about. And it might not be the name. It might not be about indigenous, references. It might be something else, right? Is that come back to what I started with about strip it down to the smallest parts which are the people, which is you, right? As somebody who works for that organization or owns it or directs it, take it back to you and say, what feels on the right side of integrity for me? Start there, because you will always be able to find justification for something, but you'll never be able to justify it to yourself if in your heart it's not in alignment with who you are, right? And I think that when we take that moment for introspection, we reflect on it, and we are able to isolate and highlight our own truth, the rest all falls into place. Because when you're living your true self and communicating your truth, it doesn't really matter what you get met with. The truth sets you free.
Yep.
So that would be my advice. And I know that there'll be older people, particularly, the older generation, that, Joel and I are relatively young, to be owning and directing a camp like ours. I know the older generation, and they're not old, but you know what I mean, slightly older than me, will be like, but there's so many complicating factors and things to consider and yada, yada. But I get brought back to, there's always justification to be found. You can justify anything. Come on. Like, we've all lived through the last.
We can debate it, justify
right,
it.
exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just live your truth. So that at the end of the day, when all is said and done, you can look yourself in the mirror and say, this was in the right side of my integrity, and start from there. The universe conspires in your favor.
That's amazing. And, it's kind of one of those funny stories. And I often use this and people say, what does IHC stand for? And really, my language, it can stand for whatever you want it to stand for, but we stand for education, emotional, physical, mental growth, integrity, honesty, and courage. Like, choose a letter and make it what you want.
Yeah, we have a camp family that choose to believe it stands for incredibly happy children. I'll take it. Like, and look, I want all your listeners to know, like, we have invested a significant amount of money in making this happen, money that arguably could have been spent elsewhere, money that could have gone into, our pockets. Like, we spent millions of dollars, to be frank, changing our name, changing all the signage at camp, getting rid of any logos or
website updates,
exactly,
redoing our Google Suites. There's a lot of the behind the scenes.
Yeah, like, it was huge. You have to understand, like, 81 years, like, of undoing 81 years. Not quite at that point. It was maybe like 77 or something.
Yeah.
But it feels so good. Yeah. It's the best money I've ever spent. Like, and I love, like, my, Joel and I have 4 kids, 2 of whom are almost 11 and 8. So they're at that phase where they're beginning to talk to us about, more, not adult, but like, their little brains are not, they're not little boys anymore. So, I love talking to them about, well, here's why we did this. And I also love their confusion as to why the camp was ever called Indian Hep. Like, they're like, we don't, like, there's India, that's not even in the States, because to them, an Indian, is a person of origin from India, they would never even use the term Indian to describe a Native American or a Native person. That's not what they learn in school anymore. So they're like confused. But then when I talk them through, like, the journey, I just love seeing them. Like, they're almost like, they don't like pat me on the back. They're like, well, we're glad you solved that no-brainer. Like,
what took you so long, Ma? And I think that goes back, as we kind of wrap up our podcast. One, it is a privilege, and we use the word privilege because we have this opportunity to make that change. We have this opportunity to do that, but to be a part of a team that can have these conversations, that can talk about things. And this is just one of the many things that we continue to talk about, but was a huge and impactful thing that when you and Joel said, yeah, this isn't good for us. Are you guys with us? And I'm pretty sure the team was unanimous. I mean, there wasn't even a dissension. It was just more, okay, how do we then do it?
It was relief.
It was relief.
It was relief, appreciation, and then complete and utter motivation to get the job done.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. So laughingly, it's almost like what I would just ask is, young generation, don't give up on the older generation. Just, they take longer to learn. They just need to understand why. And if they don't, then maybe that's a different conversation for another time. But neuroplasticity, we can still learn in our old age. We just want to understand why, and it takes a little longer. So be patient, be kind, and don't come at us hard, because as an older generation, saying, well, you don't know what it was like in 1940 in the war. I'm like, you're right. I also don't know what it was like being an indigenous person, being shipped out of the Northeast and put on a reservation and marched across the West. But I have a better understanding now, because I'm reading and I'm learning and I'm listening. Right. So that's what I would say. It's just be open, listen, hear the different stories.
Right. And I think that learn how to have dialogue, right? Whether it's with someone younger than you or older than you or your own age, like, dialogue is a beautiful thing. But when you try and start dialogue with telling people what is right and wrong in your opinion, there's nowhere to go with that. I would encourage people to get curious. That's the word I would use. Get curious if there's something, for example, within where you work or within your family or whatever, that doesn't feel quite right to you, or like you have opinions on. Don't go in with like judgment and, righteousness. Go in with questions. Like, I find it interesting that can you tell me why it is that way? Like, how does that make you feel? Like, what do you think that makes other people feel? Like, do you think that's okay? Be curious, like, not judgmental curious, like almost go back to being that younger child and explore, because I do think most people are good, right? I just think that humans are really also awesome at messing things up, right? Or not thinking things through, or
being unaware of just how it impacts others, or how it might.
Yeah, we're so insecure that we just align ourselves with one perspective, even though we might not have understood why other people have other perspectives. But through education comes change, right? So get curious, ask questions, educate yourself. You might even learn a thing or two that shifts your position on certain things. But that is definitely the key. And we've experienced that, with people that have been righteous about why we didn't do it sooner or more quickly or this and that. And we couldn't even have dialogue with them, because they were attacking, as opposed to we were actually fighting on the same side. I hate to use that word again, fight. Like, we were on their same social movement side. We wanted to be progressive, but we couldn't even have that dialogue because we felt on this stand, as opposed to tell me about what change has happened here. What are your plans for the future? Like, how are you going to accomplish your goal? In fact, what is your goal? Like, those would have been great conversation starters that I think would have been fruitful for everybody, but there was never an opportunity for dialogue, because,
it's hard to be open when you're feeling defensive and attacked. Right. But, Lauren, you said it best. We should just call this podcast Get Curious. With that concept of changing the name, why it was so important. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I know you have a busy schedule and raising amazing children as well, and raising a husband also. But I think it's incredibly impactful, and definitely one of all the podcasts we do, hopefully just informational, beyond just our name change. Hopefully people are taking a lot more from this. And, I want to put Get Curious on my shirt. I want to put it on my hat, from that. So any final words before we sign off for tonight?
No, just thank you to the listeners for listening. Thank you for being patient. with us. And, I hope that this podcast has been received in the way it was intended. And like I say, we're not the finished product. So we're open, we're curious. Get in touch if you have comments or things that you think would be helpful. And we're pushing the needle, and it feels good.
Awesome. Camp IHC, #GetCurious. Thank you all.
Good night.